Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I want you to picture something with me for a second. It's the dead of winter in the year 1256, somewhere in the mountains of northern Iran. The wind is the kind of cold that gets into your bones and just sits there. You're standing at the base of a cliff, so tall it genuinely looks, like it's holding up the sky, and perched right on top of that cliff, like something out of a myth, is a fortress. Not just any fortress. This one has a nickname that terrified an entire century. The Eagle's Nest. And below it, spread out across the valley for as far as you can see, are the tents of the largest, most efficient, most terrifying military machine the medieval world has ever produced. Tens of thousands of Mongol horsemen, siege engineers, catapult crews, and in the middle of it all, one man on horseback who has not stopped staring up at those walls for days. His name is Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, and right now, with everything at his disposal, with more firepower than almost any commander in history has ever assembled in one place, he is stuck. He cannot take this castle by force. And the reason why is not really about the walls at all. The reason is who lives inside them. For over 160 years, this fortress and the network of sister castles connected to it have been the beating heart of the single most feared organization in the medieval world. You've probably heard the name before, even if you didn't know where it came from. The Assassins. Not assassins as in a general term for killers. The Assassins, capital A. A real historical group, the Nizari Ismailis. A breakaway Shia sect that carved out a state made entirely of impossible mountain fortresses and built their entire military doctrine around something no army of the era had ever seriously had to plan for. The targeted, up-close, almost theatrical killing of the men at the very top. Not soldiers. Not garrisons, sultans, viziers, generals, caliphs on occasion, men surrounded by hundreds of guards in the most secure palaces of their time, taken out by a single operative who had sometimes spent years, literal years, working his way into that palace as a servant, a merchant, a trusted face nobody suspected, before pulling out a dagger at exactly the right moment and disappearing into legend, usually without any intention of escaping alive at all. And that's really the terrifying part, isn't it? It's one thing to fear an army you can see coming. It's another thing entirely to fear a knife that might already be standing next to you, smiling, waiting. Historical chroniclers. And yes, we should always take some of these stories with a grain of salt, because a lot of what survives about the assassins was written by their enemies. Describe attempted strikes against titans of the era like Saladin himself, the man who reclaimed Jerusalem from the Crusaders. According to some of these accounts, Saladin woke up one night in his own heavily guarded tent to find a dagger resting on his pillow, inches from his throat, with a note pinned beside it. No attacker in sight, no breach anyone could explain, just a silent message that said, in essence, "We were here. We could have done it. Remember that." Whether every detail of that story is literal fact or legend, polished over centuries almost, doesn't matter. Because the fear it represents was very, very real, and it shaped how an entire generation of rulers behaved. So that's the reputation Hulagu Khan is dealing with as he sits outside those walls in the freezing cold of 1256. This is not some minor holdout. This is the nerve center. This is Alamut. But here's where the story takes its first genuinely surprising turn. The kind of detail that never makes it into the popular, sanitized version of the evil assassin cult. Because Alamut wasn't just a nest of trained killers, tucked away behind those same walls that had repelled army after army for over a century, protected by the same terrifying reputation that made kings lose sleep, was one of the most remarkable libraries in the entire medieval world. We're talking about a collection that, according to various historical accounts, may have held somewhere in the range of 400,000 manuscripts and documents, some of them one of a kind, texts you could not find anywhere else on Earth. Alongside that library sat a fully functioning astronomical observatory, instruments and star charts and calculation tools that put this supposedly barbaric fortress of killers on par with the greatest centers of learning anywhere, from Baghdad to Cairo to Constantinople. And living inside that strange, contradictory place, part terror state, part intellectual sanctuary, was a man whose name would eventually echo through the history of science for the next 800 years and counting. a man named Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. Let's actually rewind a bit. Because to understand what's about to happen at Alamut, you need to understand who this guy was before any of this. Tusi was born in the city of Tus, in the Khorasan region, into a world that was, frankly, falling apart around him politically, but that somehow still managed to produce an extraordinary intellectual culture. From a young age, he was pushed through what can only be described as an elite, almost obsessive education, mathematics under some of the finest minds available to him, deep philosophical training in logic and metaphysics, and above all, an intense, borderline, all-consuming fascination with astronomy. This wasn't a hobby for him. This was the thing he was going to spend his entire life on. He was, by all accounts, the kind of prodigy who wasn't just memorizing what came before him. He was already starting to notice the cracks in it, starting to notice, for instance, that certain assumptions baked into Ptolemy's astronomical model, the Greek framework that had gone essentially unchallenged in any serious way for well over 1,000 years, simply didn't hold up cleanly under close mathematical scrutiny. This is a young man who, left completely to his own devices, probably would have spent a quiet, brilliant life surrounded by star charts and manuscripts, slowly building a body of work that corrected centuries of accepted wisdom. That is not what happened. Instead, his growing reputation as an exceptional scholar reached the ears of exactly the wrong, or depending on how you look at it, exactly the right people, the Nizari Ismaili state. This network of mountain fortresses ruled by an imam and famous the world over for its network of trained killers, decided that a mind like Tusi's was simply too valuable to be left wandering around, unsupervised in the outside world. And so, one way or another, the precise circumstances are debated, but the outcome is not. Tusi found himself brought into the fold, relocated to live within Ismaili territory, eventually settling for years inside Alamut and its sister fortresses. He was not thrown into a dungeon. He wasn't chained to a wall. In fact, he was given remarkable resources, access to the library, support for his research, a level of comfort most scholars of the era could only dream of. But make no mistake, this was not freedom. This was a gilded cage. A brilliant bird handed the finest perch in the world, so long as it never, ever tried to fly away. And he lived like that for years. Think about the sheer psychological weight of that situation for a moment. You are a man whose entire ambition in life is to look up at the stars and understand the universe. And instead, you find yourself living inside the operational headquarters of the most feared assassination network in the medieval world, surrounded day and night by men trained since childhood in absolute, unquestioning loyalty to a single religious leader. Men for whom killing on command was not a crime, but a sacred duty. What was that daily existence actually like for him? Did he lie awake every night wondering if his usefulness had an expiration date? Did he smile and nod through pleasant conversations during the day while quietly calculating, behind those calm eyes, some version of an exit strategy that might take years to ever become possible? We don't have a diary that answers these questions for us directly. What we do know, from the sheer volume and quality of work he produced during those years, foundational texts on logic, on ethics, on philosophy, is that whatever fear or resentment might have been simmering underneath, Tusi refused to let his captivity stop his mind from working. If his body was a prisoner, his intellect, it seems, absolutely was not. But all of that uneasy, careful equilibrium, the quiet scholar surviving inside the terrifying fortress, producing brilliant work while keeping his head down, was about to be shattered completely, because somewhere far to the east, a storm was gathering that made every previous threat to the Ismaili state look like a passing rain shower. The Mongol Empire, forged by Genghis Khan and expanded relentlessly by his sons and grandsons, had already proven, over and over again, exactly what happens to cities and states that choose resistance over submission. Bokhara, Samarkand, city after city, reduced to rubble and ash. Populations slaughtered on a scale that still staggers historians today, not always out of pure bloodlust, but as calculated, deliberate policy, a message broadcast to every future city on their path. Resist us, and this is what awaits you. And now it was Hulagu Khan's turn to carry that message forward. His brother, the great Khan monk, had handed him an explicit, Sweeping mandate. Crush, without mercy, without exception, anything standing between the Mongol Empire and total dominance of the Middle East. And right at the very top of that target list, ahead of even the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, was the Ismaili state and its impenetrable mountain fortresses, with Alamut as the crown jewel. For everyone living inside those walls, this meant one very simple, very brutal fact. Death was coming, and this time, there would be no exception carved out for anyone. The Mongols had a long, well-documented history of negotiating fairly generously with cities that surrendered promptly, and utterly, apocalyptically not negotiating with cities that resisted and then eventually fell anyway. And this is exactly what made the final years before Alamut's fall so unbearably tense. Because on one hand, the Ismaili leadership had every reason to trust in the almost mythical defensive record of their mountain strongholds, fortresses that had turned back armies for a century and a half, built into terrain so brutal that supply lines alone had broken previous invaders, long before a single arrow was fired. But on the other hand, and this is possibly a realization that Tusi, with his rigorous, analytical mind, arrived at faster and more clearly than almost anyone else around him, this was categorically not the same kind of threat they had weathered before. This wasn't a rival dynasty looking for a negotiated peace or a temporary raiding force that would eventually withdraw. This was an empire that had never, not once, simply given up and gone home. It didn't retreat. It absorbed. And so we arrive at the moment this entire story pivots around, the moment that would determine the fate of tens of thousands of lives, the fate of a library holding 400,000 irreplaceable manuscripts, and the fate of one scholar, caught directly between years of forced loyalty to the people who had confined him, and a very human, very powerful instinct to survive and protect the work of his life. Let's talk about Rukn al-Din Kersha for a second, because you cannot understand what happens next without understanding just how impossible his position was. This young man inherited leadership of the Ismaili state at, quite possibly, the single worst moment in its entire history, stepping into power after his father's death, under circumstances clouded by internal instability and suspicion. Picture the pressure here, a young leader, likely still in his 20s, suddenly responsible for an entire state. Right as the most terrifying military force on the planet is marching directly toward his front door. He didn't have decades of battlefield seasoning. He didn't have his father's or grandfather's hard-won experience managing existential crises. He had a title, a crumbling situation, and very little time to figure out what to do with either. And it was precisely in this vacuum, this moment of inexperience, fear, and desperate uncertainty at the very top, that Tusi, after years of quietly accumulating trust, respect, and intellectual authority inside the fortress, found himself in a position to influence, arguably, the single most consequential decision in the entire history of the Nizari Ismaili state. So did Tusi really sit there day after day, whispering into the young imam's ear that resistance was suicide, that the Mongols would burn everything green and everything dry? In the old phrase, if they met any resistance at all? Here's where the historical record gets genuinely, deliciously murky, and honestly, that ambiguity is part of what makes this story so compelling. Almost 8 centuries later, some chroniclers paint Tusi as something close to a master strategist, operating quietly from the shadows, a man who used his considerable intellectual authority and his carefully built relationship with an inexperienced, frightened young ruler to steer him, deliberately and persistently, toward surrender, using every tool of rhetoric and cold logic at his disposal to convince Rukn al-Din that resistance would only guarantee total annihilation. Other accounts push back hard against that narrative, suggesting instead that Tusi was simply a brilliant man caught in a political storm, entirely beyond his control, and that his eventual departure from the fortress to join Hulagu's court happened only after the surrender was already underway, a survivor making the best of a catastrophe he didn't orchestrate, rather than an architect pulling strings from the very beginning. But whichever version is closer to the literal truth, the outcome that actually happened is not in dispute, and it's the outcome that matters for where we're going next in this story. The young imam's resolve collapsed under the sheer, undeniable weight of what was sitting outside his walls, faced with the horrifying mathematical certainty that no fortification on earth would save anyone inside if Hulagu decided to make an example of them. Rukn al-Din gave the order that would end a century and a half of legend. In a single afternoon, open the gates. We surrender. Just sit with that moment for a second. Think about the men actually guarding those walls. Warriors trained from childhood in absolute, unwavering loyalty. Men who had grown up hearing stories of this fortress as something sacred, something eternal, something that simply did not fall. Imagine their shock, standing at their posts, weapons in hand, as the order comes down not to fight, but to fling open the same gates that had turned away the greatest armies of the era for 160 straight years, to let their most feared enemy walk in unopposed, without a single arrow loosed, without a single sword raised in its defense. Something that had taken a century and a half to build as an idea, as a myth, as a symbol of the impossible, came apart in the space of an afternoon. And as Mongol torches began consuming Alamut's walls, as one of the most extraordinary private libraries the medieval world had ever assembled started turning into smoke and drifting ash on that freezing mountain wind, one single man walked out through those burning gates, not dragged in chains toward captivity, not marched off toward execution, but escorted, almost ceremonially, by Hulagu Khan's own personal guard as an honored guest. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi was not killed. He was not enslaved. In the space of a single day, he transformed from a scholar who had been, for all practical purposes, a captive of the most feared organization in the medieval world, into the chief scientific and astronomical advisor to Hulagu Khan himself, grandson of the greatest conqueror history had ever produced. How does something like that even happen? How does a man go, in the course of one catastrophic afternoon, from prisoner of the fortress to trusted advisor of the men burning it to the ground? The answer, as strange as it sounds, really does come down to one single thing: knowledge. Because for all the almost unimaginable brutality that defined Hulagu's military campaigns, and make no mistake, this was a man whose armies would go on, within just a couple of years, to raise Baghdad itself and effectively in the 500-year-old Abbasid Caliphate. He genuinely, deeply respected scholarship and science. Some historians point to the influence of his wife, Dokuz Khatun, a Christian noblewoman known for advocating protection of scholars, clergy, and places of learning wherever the Mongol armies advanced, whatever the exact cause. When word reached Hulagu that a brilliant astronomer and mathematician had just walked out of Alamut, he didn't hesitate. He folded Tusi into his inner circle almost immediately, and then went several steps further. He commissioned Tusi to design and build what would become one of the greatest astronomical observatories of the entire era in the city of Moraga, an institution that would go on to attract some of the finest scientific minds of the age, from China all the way to the Islamic world's western frontier in Spain. And here's maybe the single most jaw-dropping detail in this entire story, the part that, honestly, still gets debated by historians today. Tusi didn't just secure his own survival. He apparently used his sudden, newfound influence with Hulagu to do something that must have seemed almost impossible in an era when entire cities were being wiped off the map. Without a second thought, he pushed to salvage a significant portion of Alamut's scientific and philosophical treasures before the fire could consume everything. Out of that staggering collection of manuscripts, remember, we're talking potentially around 400,000 documents, an almost unimaginable number for the medieval world. A meaningful portion is believed to have survived, specifically because of this intervention, rescued and relocated even as the empire around them burned to the ground. So while an entire civilization was collapsing into dust, one single man managed to reach into the fire and pull out a piece of humanity's collective knowledge, saving it from total, permanent extinction. But here's the thing: that exact moment, the moment scholarship was pulled back from the flames, is the very same moment that opened up a question that has followed Nasir al-Din al-Tusi across the centuries ever since. A question that still has no clean, universally agreed-upon answer even today. Was Tusi a traitor in the truest sense of the word? A man who sold out the very people who had sheltered him, fed him, and given him the resources to do his life's work for years, all in exchange for his own survival and a cushy new position, serving an even more terrifying master? Or was he a genius who saw clearly what so many around him were blind to? That resistance against an unstoppable force would accomplish nothing except adding more blood to an already overflowing river, and that the single most valuable thing he could do in the face of an unbeatable enemy was to salvage whatever knowledge and learning could still be saved, even if that meant sacrificing loyalty toward people who had, after all, taken his freedom from him in the first place? Really sit with that question for a minute, because this isn't just a dusty historical trivia question. This is a genuinely difficult moral puzzle, one that has repeated itself in different forms across almost every century of human history. Whenever a person finds themselves trapped between a loyalty that was never freely chosen and a survival instinct, paired with a desire to protect something they believe matters more than any single institution or ruler, is loyalty to your captors, even after years spent among them, some kind of unbreakable moral duty regardless of circumstances? Or is there a point at which true loyalty shifts, not to the specific people who happen to control your fate, but to something larger than any of them, to knowledge itself, to learning, to whatever legacy will still matter long after every king, emperor, and conqueror involved has been reduced to a name in a history book gathering dust on a shelf? And here's the almost unbelievable twist that makes this whole story even richer. Despite everything, despite the murky, contested circumstances of Alamut's fall, despite centuries of historians arguing over his motives, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi was not remembered by history as some forgotten footnote or minor traitor. He went on to become one of the most influential scientific minds in the entire history of astronomy and mathematics. His work on planetary motion, and specifically what's known today as the Tusi couple, a mathematical device he developed to help resolve some of the deep internal inconsistencies in Ptolemy's ancient model of the universe, would go on to influence generations of astronomers who came after him. And here's the part that genuinely gives me chills every time I think about it. A number of modern historians of science have identified striking, specific mathematical parallels between Tusi's models and the work of Nicholas Copernicus himself, the man who, centuries later, would upend humanity's entire understanding of our place in the universe by proposing that the Earth revolves around the sun rather than the other way around. Think about that thread for a second. A thread that starts in a besieged mountain fortress in Iran in the year 1256, with a captive scholar watching his world burn around him, and ends up quietly, invisibly influencing one of the most revolutionary scientific breakthroughs in the entire history of the Western world, centuries later. So here's the question I want to leave you with, because I genuinely think it deserves more than just a passing thought. If you were in Nasir al-Din al-Tusi's position, trapped inside a fortress you knew, with total certainty, was going to fall no matter what anyone did, surrounded by people whose fate was already sealed, and handed a single, narrow window of opportunity to save your own life and to save an irreplaceable piece of human knowledge from being lost forever, would you have done exactly what he did? Was rescuing knowledge worth the price of a broken loyalty? Or are there principles that should never be compromised, no matter the cost? Even if that cost means watching centuries of accumulated wisdom turn to ash forever? Let me know what you honestly think down in the comments, because I have a feeling this is one of those questions that's never going to have a clean answer everyone agrees on. And if you enjoyed this journey through one of the strangest, most morally complicated moments in human history, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who's into history as much as you are. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Because trust me, reality is very often stranger and far more dramatic than anything fiction could ever come up with. See you in the next one.